So we've talked about your first key, your intro. We talked about how to set it up. We talked about the different aspects of it. Your character, your villain, your plot, your world building, all that stuff, right? So then we're going into our second key, first act. Now, the intro is a part of the first act in a way, but I want to make sure that was a whole separate thing, because that's a whole, getting your intro done properly is more than just, throwing it into your first act. It is a part of your first act, but it's really its own key to itself. Like, you have to nail that down. And now we can nail down our first act. So through these videos, I'm going to be talking about our first act. So now you guys can get a more understanding of where I'm coming from, where my 5 keys will be. The intro, the first act, second act, third act, and then I'm going to have the last one be the conclusion as its own little thing, because that is also important, even though that's a part of the third act. So let's break down what are the key elements to make your first act. So all of these are kind of tying into what we already talked about with the first key, the intro. But it's almost like you could say the first act and the second key is more of extending onto the first key, or intro. So the first one makes perfect sense with what we talked about with setting up your main character as the first main element you want to nail down in your first key. The first main element you want to nail down in your second key, the first act, is that of bring your side characters in. I already made a video somewhat talking about this, but we're going to, in the next couple weeks, hopefully, go more in depth into showing how in the opening of a movie, people, like how to properly, not in the just opening, but like in the first half hour of your movie, how to set up your extra characters, making sure that you use your main character to set up these characters. You already set up your main character. Now when you set up these side characters, the importance of these side characters. Why do we need these side characters? Well, it's because the side characters, they bring out more of the main character, for one thing, right? Also, if it was, you do have some stories like The Life of Pi, where it's literally just a boy and a tiger. But for the most part, you have to have other people filling in this world, kind of building into the world building. I mean, the other characters are there to build up the main character, but also show that this is like a live world where there's people around. There are things going on. So that's important, and the first thing is nail down that. If you can't nail down the extra characters in your movie and they're distracting with how terrible they are, people are going to want to stop your movie because they can't stand the secondary characters. Even if your main character is good, if they can't stand the other characters in the movie, they're going to turn it off. So that's why that's the first element you need to nail down in your first act. Is the next one, as it ties into the whole character thing, is that of the villain. You already set up your villain. This is now the time when you expand on your villain. You see the villain do very first acts of violence. You have, The Dark Knight, you have the opening scene where you meet the Joker, and you get to know the Joker a little bit in those first moments of the Joker, but then the first act is where you see more of the Joker, you understand more of him. You see when, the classic moment where he does the pencil trick, where all that. That is in your first act. That's where you are setting up that stuff, where you're like, okay, we already know who this villain is, but now we're setting up even more who the villain is, how the villain acts, even more, and your villain should already be set up. This is where you're going to show even more of who the villain is before you enter your second act, where you really show the high point of the villain's actions, where you see all the things going down, and then in your third act, you'll see the conclusion to it. And the other thing about that is, if you don't have a villain, another way you can say it, as we've talked about a little bit before in that original video, on our first key, the intro, we talked about how, what if you don't have a villain? You don't always need a villain. So that's why the other aspect you could say, instead of expanding on your villain, you could say instead, something goes wrong. This is the moment that the thing goes wrong. That already set up that there are problems out there, but this is where really the action gets started, where everything goes wrong and it sets the hero on his journey. So either that being with a villain, or that's with a circumstance that kicks off our story. Next one is just like with our intro, we talked about setting up your world. Now we are expanding on it. We talked about in our videos on the world building. We went through the first 10 minutes of the Batman. We talked about how we set up the world. But now in the next scenes after that, you see him like, break into the club. You see this different stuff like that. That's expanding on this other aspect of the world. You already set up what your world is like. Now you're expanding on it. You're showing more of what the world is before you head into your second act. That's a big thing about the first act, the second key, is that the whole point of the first act is it's setting up, and it should be good in itself, but one of the big things is it's setting up the rest of it. You need to nail that down. You need to properly, you already set up somewhat in the intro, but now we're like even further like nailing it down so that you go into the second act, understanding this world, understanding the villains and stuff like that. The next one, so we have talked about the plot in our intro, but we've also mentioned how the story is the train, while the plot is the engine that runs the train. So this really, you're setting up in your intro your plot. Your story really, like, while there's some aspects of the story that's in your intro, the story really begins in the first act. In a way, the intro is where you start the story, but here's when you really pick up and like, this is the story. Let's keep going on this story. So that's the next aspect that you need to nail down in your first act. That same aspect, you have develop your plot. Now, you already set up your plot. This is where you develop it. You further on. Again, as I talked about before, the second key, the first act, is literally just, you could nail it down, you could put it into one word, and that is develop or expand on your intro. It's expand. That is the word to describe what we're talking about in our second key. So you're expanding, you're developing on your plot. So this is what the plot is. Now let's develop it more. Let's show what's the plot leading to. Where are we going with this plot? How are we going to drag our story along with this plot? This is, in your first act, you're really doing a lot of that. That is the elements that builds up your second key, your first act. That's where you do all that. You really want to, by the end of your first act, you want to have all these characters developed and set up, and then you go into your second act, and that's where the height of all the movie is. That's where the action is, all that different stuff. There can be action in the first act. There should be, probably, to keep the people's attention. But for the most part, you want it so by the end of the first act, the main thing that people got out of it is they're going into the second act knowing these characters, knowing how this world works, knowing how the plot works, knowing what the story is about, all that different stuff. So that when you enter that second act, you're already prepared. Let's hope that we get to this year breaking down. I'll be putting into movie forms each of these elements. I'll do the same as I did last year, where I made a video for a good example and a bad example, and we'll see how long it takes to do that. It should take only a couple months. Hopefully we can this year get to all 3 acts, the next 3 keys, and then go into next year with the conclusion. Last year I was only able to get to the first one because my life was hectic, but hopefully this year we can get to more of that stuff. So guys, tell me your thoughts below on what you guys think of what I talked about. Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? What are some aspects you can bring to this? I would love to hear more. This channel is dedicated to sparking creative minds, but it's a discussion, right? I'm giving my insight, but I want to hear you guys' insight. If you guys have any aspects of it that you disagree with me on, or that you say, hey, you could expand on this even more than you are, please comment down below your thoughts on this stuff. This is a community. A lot of YouTubers forget that this is a form of social media. So it's important that you guys bring your elements into this. I want to hear your thoughts, and hopefully if you are here, you want to hear my thoughts as well. On that same topic, if you guys haven't yet, please consider subscribing so we can grow this community even more, because again, the bigger the community we get here, the more I can, set aside to put it into this community. Right now, I'm trying to put as much as I can, but I work full time, so I can't always be, putting all my effort into this. Again, but if this community starts getting big enough, I might start going part-time on my other jobs, part-time on this, so I can put more work into this. So guys, thank you guys for watching. This has been the Movie Night Reviewer. Peter Wary, signing off.